You can't look away from this problem anymore. The $35 trillion mountain of our national debt has become impossible to climb, and way too many politicians are happy to just kick the can down the road every time. But there's only a few scenarios that could result from this ballooning debt, and none of them are good for the average citizen. So what could happen, and what is that you could do to protect yourself? While this is not financial advice, I want to take a deeper look into each of those scenarios and truly understand the gravity of the problem. Before that, there's a brutal truth that we need to come to terms with. We'll probably never be able to pay off the national debt as far as it exceeds both the total supply of money in the system at around $21 trillion and the national GDP under just $29 trillion. That leaves us with a few scenarios in the next few years. Number one, the US could drastically reduce its spending on military and welfare programs to start aggressively paying off its debt. Two, it could massively raise taxes to increase government revenue to pay back the debt. 3, the US could officially announce a default on its debt obligations, resulting in a shutdown of the government. And number 4, which is the scariest scenario, the Federal Reserve keeps printing more and more money, eventually pushing the US into a spiral of hyperinflation. None of these potential outcomes are pretty, which is why most politicians would just delay the inevitable. The 4-year cycle of governments on the debt issue feels like presidents playing catch with a live grenade, hoping it explodes in the other's hands. And as long as the government doesn't take the first step to do something about it, neither will the Federal Reserve. Here's Chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, during a congressional hearing last year dismissing the very idea that the ballooning national debt is even a problem to begin with, prompting a surprised reaction from everyone else.
If we were, constrained in our monetary policy by the budgetary situation of the United States, and we're not, we're clearly not. The path we're on is not sustainable, but the level of debt that we have is not unsustainable, is sustainable, put it that way. So we don't think about interest costs when we make monetary policy. We think about maximum employment and price stability.
It's your opinion that the level of debt we have is sustainable?
Yes. I mean, we have the largest economy in the world. We can service this debt. That's not the problem. The problem is that we're on a path where the debt is growing substantially faster than the economy. And that's kind of by definition, in the long run, unsustainable. And the way countries have gotten or fixed that is with longer term programs that have bipartisan support and that address the actual problem in the budget. That's really the formula.
Note that even Jerome Powell doesn't say that the US actually has the capacity to pay back the national debt. Sounds like all he's really referring to is that something has to be done to correct the course for the future, and I don't think it would be alarmist to suggest that problem is already here. And most of all, there's no action plan or political cooperation willing to do something about it. Think about the first 2 potential outcomes I laid out, which is the government slashing expenditure or raising taxes. It happens to be that both of these ideas are extremely unpopular and would likely cost a lot of political capital to do so. Raising the tax on the middle and working class means crushing the backbone of the American economy, while raising taxes on the rich and corporations means slowing down the most important engines for growth in this capitalist system. And on the other end, cutting down on government expenditure is a plan that resonates more with the Republican Party, but it's not going to be any less unpopular. The 3 largest expenditures of the government right now are the military, welfare, or development programs and interest on previous debt. At best, the first 2 of these can have cuts, meaning millions of Americans will feel the squeeze as their welfare programs become less supportive. Doing that would also require a lot of will, which a 4-year Republican president might not be capable of doing at such a damage to themselves politically. Donald Trump, for example, is now sounding the alarm for what he really believes needs to happen, which is declaration of default. Here's what he said during a recent town hall meeting with CNN's Caitlin Collins.
I say to the Republicans out there, congressmen, senators, if they don't give you massive cuts, you're going to have to do a default. And I don't believe they're going to do a default because I think the Democrats will absolutely cave because you don't want to have that happen. But it's better than what we're doing right now, because we're spending money like drunken sailors.
So just to be clear, Mr. President, you think the U.S. should default if the White House does not agree to the spending cuts Republicans are demanding?
You might as well do it now because you'll do it later. Because we have to save this country. Our country is dying. Our country is being destroyed by stupid people, by very stupid people.
You once said that using the debt ceiling as a negotiating wedge just could not happen. You said that when you were in the Oval Office.
That's when I was president.
So why is it different now that you're out of office?
Because now I'm not president.
That's not going to be a pretty sight, but may be inevitable sooner or later if all other options exhaust. Remember, a default simply means the government declaring that it does not have money to pay back investors and bondholders, and while they can't do anything about it, shattering the trust in the government, economy, and currency will be absolutely shattering. Every individual and company will hold back on spending, be extremely fiscally conservative, lay off workers, and slow down production. All of that will lead to a crippling economic recession that brings America to a grinding halt. Not to mention the American economy and the dollar are so intricately tied to the rest of the world that the ripples would be created across the world economy. That's a scary scenario that we have no experience on how to deal with, but it could become unavoidable if urgent action isn't taken to rein in this swirling ball of debt. But here's the fourth scenario, which works on a longer and more foreseeable time frame, and is the likeliest of all. It's that the US government keeps delaying the inevitable for several more decades, raising the debt ceiling and printing more money to stay afloat every time. That's what has been happening for basically most of the last 5 decades, especially after the United States went off the gold standard in 1971 and introduced a system of fiat currency. It is that system where such debt is even possible because the money supply doesn't need to be backed by something of real value. That's where government control of currency and inflation comes from, and inevitably the mismanagement and debt. But inflation is cumulative, and if we continue down this path, all we're going to see is more and more inflation. Watch former chairman of the Federal Reserve Alan Greenspan say it candidly that the United States doesn't need to default because we can just keep printing more money.
Are U.S. Treasury bonds still safe to invest in?
Very much so. I think this is not an issue of credit rating. The United States can pay any debt it has because we can always print money to do that. So there is zero probability of default.
That shows a distance from the real world impact of the inflation that would occur because a loss of the purchasing power of the dollar would only be a temporary remedy that creates more trouble down the line. Remember, there's one thing that you can almost always be sure of. Inflation will likely not slow down, and you'll always need to think of ways to outrun it. Inflation lowers the real value of the national debt because the dollars it is denominated in goes down in value. Conversely, any level of deflation back from it increases the value of the dollar and therefore increases the debt burden. The direction is clear. Inflation is a never-ending treadmill both for governments and individuals, and the only thing you can do is invest in assets that are not historically affected by it, like gold and silver, while also working to make more money than you made last year just to stay in the same place. At a time like this, the words of one of America's most respected presidents, Ronald Reagan, are worth a listen.
Some government programs seemed so worthwhile that borrowing to fund them didn't bother us. By 1960, our national debt stood at $284 billion. Congress in 1971 decided to put a ceiling of $400 billion on our ability to borrow. Today, the debt is $934 billion. So-called temporary increases or extensions in the debt ceiling have been allowed 21 times in these 10 years. And now, I've been forced to ask for another increase in the debt ceiling, or the government will be unable to function past the middle of February. And I've only been here 16 days. Before we reach the day when we can reduce the debt ceiling, we may, in spite of our best efforts, see a national debt in excess of $1 trillion. Now, this is a figure that's literally beyond our comprehension. We know now that inflation results from all that deficit spending. Government has only 2 ways of getting money other than raising taxes. It can go into the money market and borrow, competing with its own citizens and driving up interest rates, which it has done, or it can print money, and it's done that. Both methods are inflationary.
That level of understanding seems to have been lost in our modern politics, but that doesn't make the problems go away. In fact, we're headed for a disaster if our politicians don't smarten up and develop bipartisan cooperation to grab the debt balloon before it flies out of reach. But let me know in the comments how you process this, because it's a debate we'll all be forced to deal with sooner or later.